When she was young, Nika had an interesting hobby, and her first boyfriend introduced her to a specific kind of intimacy that involved the use of whips, handcuffs, and other curious paraphernalia. Inexperienced Nika, who was only 22 at the time, was terribly afraid and ashamed of it, but at the same time felt a genuine interest. The juicy subject turned her on. She imagined how she would brag to her friends about her experience later. Of course, she ended up not being able to tell anyone about their hobby. It turned out to be too personal, but the interest stayed in her life for a long time. Exactly until they broke up with her lover. When their relationship with the young man collapsed and Nika realized that nothing could be brought back, she cried for a long time. Finding such a perfect partner in bed was something she had to try hard to do. The subject was delicate and not suitable for everyone. What she was most worried about was that her future man wouldn't be. And just like that, she looked straight into the water. Her next boyfriend, Alex, who later became her husband after one attempt, flatly refused to get involved. Nika had been on him for a full week and then accepted his decision. She loved Alex, and to refuse him because of such nonsense would be utter folly. Nika naively thought that as soon as she excluded this interest from her life, she would immediately forget about it. But the forbidden fruit is sweet, and it is known for sure. Every year, the desire grew like a snowball, which threatened in one moment to cover her head. Hundreds of revised adult videos on the subject had not had the desired effect. Nika longed to experience these emotions again. Periodically, secretly from Alex, she looked through thematic groups on social networks, chatting there on behalf of others with like-minded people. For a while, this gave some satisfaction, but in the end, it led to more hunger. Nika tried not to say anything to her husband about it. Alex loved her unconditionally, trying to please her every whim. She didn't want to spoil the relationship because of her personal problems. It all started with an ordinary correspondence. On her secret page, a man wrote. He introduced himself as Alvin and told her that he had found her in one of those groups where she was socializing with like-minded people. He immediately described his needs. He wanted a woman who would submit to him. Online for now, but Alvin hadn't ruled out the possibility of meeting outside the internet. Nika became uncomfortable, and she didn't get in touch for days. Two personalities were fighting in her. One who kept telling her she should answer, and the other who begged her not to. 3 days later, Alvin's consent message came back. Nika was shaking with excitement at this point, and a strange smile wandered across her lips. She had felt the same emotions the first time her ex-boyfriend had opened up this uncharted world to her. Now Nika was completely in the hands of her overlord. The sensation was unusual, alluring. Alvin kept her in suspense the whole time. The woman never knew when he would remind her of himself and give her some task. It could have happened anywhere. On a family trip to visit relatives, sash at the theater during a play, or at an important meeting at work. Sometimes Nika would catch herself laughing silly or her face blushing as she read the messages. The new secret life was very much to her liking. Alex also noted for himself the changes in his wife's behavior. She suddenly became more gentle, constantly craving his attention, intimacy, and contact. He could not rejoice at her sudden changes and enjoyed every minute spent in bed with his beloved. Of course, Alex did not even realize that at the moment of maximum intimacy with him, Veronica imagines a completely different person who does very different things to her. Her secret relationship with Alvin had been going on for months, and the man began to insistently ask for a real meeting. This frightened Nika, because it's one thing to have funny correspondence, to fulfill some requests and send pictures, and another to meet in person, to actually cheat on her husband. That was not in her plans. All this time, the woman hoped that her interlocutor had forgotten about his desire to meet. But her hopes proved futile. Alvin pressured her literally, forcing her to agree to a meeting. For a few days, Nika disappeared from their chat room again to mull over the situation. Time dragged on endlessly for the woman. She was tossing and turning between two opposing options, not knowing which one to choose. Finally, she made up her mind, soothing her conscience with the thought that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and it would be unwise not to take it. And that's exactly what Nika wrote Alvin about. The would-be lover stopped contacting her after he read that message. Nika got nervous, and then she received a message that contained only a few words. The fool had had enough. Everything that happened next, she remembered with a shudder for a long time. Alvin, with whom Nika had been communicating under a false name, had tracked her down, found out who her husband was, and barely got him to agree to a real meeting. Alvin sent all their correspondence to Alex from realizing what she was writing to her internet lover and what pictures she was sending him. And that now it was all seen, and her husband Nika felt bad. It was even worse for Alex himself. He was tearing and tearing. His spouse had never seen him so angry. When Alexander received a message from an unknown man on social networks, he did not pay much attention to it, but when he began to send photos of his wife of an obviously intimate nature, Alex decided to listen to what the stranger had to say. It took Alex a long time to get over his shock. He wondered why his loving and affectionate wife had gone through with it. They had no preconditions for cheating. Yes, once at the beginning of a relationship, Alex had denied her a favorite form of lovemaking. Did it have that effect? At first he blamed himself. He thought he was the one who had pushed his wife to cheat by saying no. Then came the realization that he had nothing to do with it. And the cheating had been his wife's deliberate choice, and she was the only one to blame. They fought all night, throwing mutual complaints at each other. Never in all the years they had spent together had they quarreled so much. And needless to say, they had never had such a serious topic on their agenda. Alex berated his wife for having an affair with another man, and he couldn't believe what was happening. It seemed to him that he was about to wake up, and all this would remain only in his memories as a terrible dream. He loved Nika, wanted her to bear him a daughter, wanted a full family. Those dreams were not going to come true, and he realized that so clearly he wanted to howl. The divorce was swift, in spite of Nika's relentless begging of her husband's forgiveness, but he held on as best he could not to give in to her entreaties out of pity. There was virtually nothing for the couple to share. Nika took the appliances from the kitchen, and Alex, the television set, and that was all they had managed to acquire during this time. On the other hand, the man was glad they didn't have to share anything. He wanted to forget the whole story as quickly as possible and never see his ex-wife again. Veronica tried for a long time to find out who the man who introduced himself to Alvin really was. On her own, the woman could not find a single clue in a correspondence, so she resorted to outside help. Her old acquaintance sometimes hacked into other people's accounts and pages. After a couple of days, he gave her the user's details, and when she read his name, she froze with her mouth open. How could she have forgotten about this man? And her former classmate had been hitting on her for a long time, but his love was not mutual. At first, Nika politely refused him, but when he started hitting on her even harder, she couldn't take it anymore and became very rude. The boy held a grudge against her. He followed her on social networks for a long time, checked her out in various programs, and even found out about her specific interests. And when the beloved got married, he began to think about how to get back at her. All these conflicts with a former classmate were so long ago that Nika had completely forgotten that she had such a detractor. But now he had accomplished what he wanted. Her husband had left her. Out of desperation, Nika threw herself headlong into her work to think as little as possible about what her life had become. In the evenings, when she came home to a cold apartment where no one was waiting for her, she'd dine on a bottle of wine and sob at the thought of destroying her life with her own hands. This next story is incredibly interesting about Jessica and Jarvis. I recommend everyone to watch to the end. Jessica and Jarvis met at university. They were in different majors and different courses. Jarvis was 2 years older. But when one day he saw the fragile blonde Jessica on September 1, he lost his head. The girl's looks combined everything he liked so much. Jessica was shy, hard to get along with people, and afraid of everything in the world. Standing at that very first university ruler, she was nervous and constantly fiddling with the lock on her bag. Here and now a new life was beginning for her. Jarvis was a fussy, fun-loving, outgoing guy. He participated in every amateur activity, which attracted the girls. Smiling, handsome young man who also knows how to sing could not go unnoticed. When he started courting Jessica, she didn't know where to turn from it. The advances were so persistent that the girl, who had not yet been kissed, was frightened. Jarvis promised her then that by the end of the year, she would be with him, and he was right. When Jessica was in her 3rd year, at her annual checkup at the women's doctor's office, she was informed with a smile that she was pregnant. She cried all day until Jarvis came home from work. It seemed to her that her entire future perfect life was crumbling at the moment. Jarvis, though shocked by the news, didn't show it. Beloved was already in a depressed state. He could not let her see his weakness. So with a smile he spun Jessica around and offered to sign as soon as possible. And so their little unit of society was formed. Jarvis, Jessica, and their son Jim. Gratitude for her husband, a feeling Jessica felt day in and day out. He took over the care of the baby and allowed his spouse to first graduate to the end of university and then enter her dream job. Jessica had always wanted to be a translator, now that Jim was 5. His mother was a sought-after and well-paid professional. The woman traveled extensively on business trips, interacted with interesting people, and every time she returned home to her family with great pleasure. Jarvis's friends wondered how he allowed his wife to be away so often, and even be in constant contact with other men. They kept telling him that he should not be so negligent to his wife, and that he should be more strict. But Jarvis smiled and answered them that trust was the key to a successful relationship. His friends laughed at him and said he would get burned with that approach. Jessica really was faithful to her husband all the time, no matter how many men were around her. No matter how many times her foreign colleagues complimented her, she always remained faithful to only one Jarvis. Frankly speaking, Jessica was sharply negative about people who cheated while in a relationship. That was until she met Martin. Martin, a middle-aged man with a well-built figure and a thick red beard. The company that had opened a branch in our country sent him to supervise the process. Jessica was his interpreter. At first, as always, she tried to keep her distance. Over the years of service, the woman had learned that boundaries had to be marked pretty clearly at once. If you don't, you're screwed. Once she had to break a contract early simply because the man she worked for wouldn't give her a pass, thinking that Jessica was just trying to make herself feel better about her refusals. It was different with Martin. He behaved like a true gentleman, not trespassing on his interpreter's boundaries. During the 2 months they worked together, they never once spoke to Jessica about personal matters. When he asked her to have dinner together in a restaurant, at first out of habit, the woman refused, but Martin pleaded, "Jessica, please, I'm about to wait for tea from loneliness," and the interpreter gave weakness. She did not tell her spouse that it was a meeting with her boss, just said she was delayed at work. Why she did so, she did not know, because never before Jarvis did not organize her jealousy scene and probably would have treated her and Martin dinner calmly. They spent the evening chatting like good old friends, laughing and sharing life stories. It was the first time in Jessica's years as an interpreter that she had had such a pleasant experience with a foreigner. She enjoyed his fiery speech, his beautiful, well-placed voice. When Martin smiled, dimples appeared on his cheeks, the beard hiding your beautiful dimples. Jessica smiled. They drank a bottle of expensive wine for 2 and switched to you. The man laughed. "Without the beard, I look like a ridiculous boy. Do you want to see a picture?" The time passed quickly while we were talking to each other. The hands of the clock had long passed 12 o'clock at night. and when Jessica noticed this, she hurriedly rushed home. "Let me call you a cab to the hotel," she told her companion. It was beginning to spring outside. The snow had almost completely melted. There were a few small drifts of snow, and it smelled like wet earth, swollen buds, and something happy. Jessica didn't get home until morning that day, having spent the night in Martin's room. She drove home at 4 a.m. in the back of a cab, choking back tears. The alcohol was beginning to let up. Sobriety of mind was returning. The woman realized that even now something had happened that shouldn't have. She was kicking herself for breaking the chain of command, for drinking so much. Their intimacy with Martin was an impulse of passion, a momentary desire that would affect her later life. All the way home, Jessica wondered what to do. Her conscience tormented her. She could not help but tell Jarvis what had happened between her and Martin. Sooner or later the lie would come out, and then it would be worse. But telling her husband about her infidelity was scary too. Jarvis loved her dearly and trusted her as himself. The thought made her burst into tears in her voice. The cab driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, and without taking his eyes off the road, handed her a packet of paper tissues. She knew her husband was up at 5 for a run. She would arrive just as Jarvis woke up to see her in all her glory with smeared makeup, swollen with tears. She'll have to tell everything now. She has to. Jarvis got out of the shower just as Jessica just stepped into the apartment. He saw her sad eyes and a smudge of mascara. The man rushed over to his wife, thinking of the worst thing that could have happened to her. Someone had hurt her. He had to protect her. And when she clung to him with her whole body and hugged him tightly, she sobbed only 3 words, "I cheated on you." His whole world collapsed overnight. They talked, sitting in the kitchen for hours, until Jim woke up. The man wanted to howl with heartache, but he restrained himself and smiled at his child with the last of his strength. The son was still too young to know about adult problems. After that, the husband silently gathered himself up his son and they left. Jessica was left home alone, immersed in heavy thoughts. In the evening, the spouse said she wanted to take a break from the relationship. Jarvis wanted to be alone somewhere, to sort himself out and his attitude about the situation. He bought a plane ticket, after which he drank nonstop at the beach for almost 2 weeks, drowning his sorrows. He couldn't make up his mind to get a divorce. He felt sorry for Jim, and in his heart Jarvis still loved Jessica, in spite of what she had done to him. They lived together until their son came of age. Then one day, Jarvis packed up and left for a rental apartment. The love for his wife thinned with each passing year, and the son grew up. The man realized that now he was free of all his obligations. Jessica's spouse made the decision, albeit with difficulty. In the long 13 years since that fateful day, she had naively assumed everything was back to normal, but life had pushed her into a new ordeal that Jessica threatened not to live through. Such is the story. Share in the comments what you think of this situation and the character's behavior.